In September 1944, a letter arrived at Third Army headquarters in eastern France. The mayor of Nancy was writing to General George Patton with an unusual request. Do not enter our city. Do not attack. Go around us. Leave Nancy alone. Most accounts of what happened next assume Patton ignored the letter and drove his tanks straight through the city gates anyway. That assumption is wrong. What Patton actually did was more calculated, more effective, and resulted in one of the cleanest operational victories of the entire Western Front campaign. But to understand how a mayor's refusal became the setup for Patton's success, you have to understand what was happening in the 3 weeks before that letter ever arrived. By late August 1944, Patton's Third Army had accomplished something remarkable. In roughly 30 days, since breaking out from the Normandy beachhead, American armored divisions had driven hundreds of miles across France at speeds that exceeded even optimistic Allied planning estimates. German forces were in retreat across a broad front. The Wehrmacht's defensive structure in France was collapsing. By August 31st, lead elements of Third Army were standing on the west bank of the Moselle River, looking east toward Germany. The Rhine felt achievable. The end of the war in Europe felt, for a brief moment, like something with a realistic timeline attached to it. And then the fuel ran out. This moment appears in every serious military history of the campaign because it illustrates a fundamental constraint of modern mechanized warfare. An army in motion is a consumption system. Patton's Third Army was burning approximately 400,000 gallons of gasoline every single day during active operations. That fuel had to be transported from ports on the Normandy coast across several hundred miles of French roads and railways that had been systematically destroyed during the pre-invasion bombing campaign. In early September 1944, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower made a strategic allocation decision. He redirected a significant portion of available Allied fuel supplies northward to support Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Montgomery was planning Operation Market Garden, an ambitious airborne assault in the Netherlands designed to cross the Rhine and potentially end the war by Christmas. The fuel that would have gone to Patton went to Montgomery instead. Patton's tanks stopped moving, not because of enemy resistance, not because of difficult terrain. They stopped because there was nothing to put in their engines. For 5 days in early September, Third Army sat essentially immobile in eastern France. 5 days during which German forces that had been in headlong retreat were given time to stop running, to catch their breath, organize defensive positions, bring up reinforcements, and register artillery on the river crossings that Third Army would need to force. When fuel finally arrived in sufficient quantities and Third Army lurched back into motion, the operational environment had fundamentally changed. German defensive positions were now prepared and manned, and directly in the path of the eastward advance sat a city that during those 5 days of American immobility had transformed from a minor obstacle into a significant defensive problem. There is a reason Nancy appeared on every German defensive plan for eastern France in September 1944, and that reason was pure geography. The Moselle River wrapped around Nancy's western and northern edges. It was wide, fast-flowing, and deep enough to present a serious obstacle to any attacking force attempting to establish a bridgehead. To the east of Nancy, a chain of elevated ridges known as the Grand Couronne, formed a natural defensive barrier. These heights gave defenders commanding observation over all approaches to the city. Nancy sat in the gap between the river and the high ground. To bypass the city entirely was logistically complicated and required significant detours that consumed time and fuel Third Army did not have to spare. To attack directly from the west meant crossing the Moselle under fire and then fighting through urban terrain while exposed to German artillery on the heights. To defend Nancy from the east was straightforward for any competent commander with adequate forces. General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding German Army Group G, understood Nancy's defensive value precisely. He moved reinforcements into the Nancy sector, positioning elements of two Panzer Grenadier divisions to defend the river crossings and control the high ground. German engineers mined the bridges across the Moselle. Artillery units registered all obvious approach roads with pre-planned fire missions. Against this military reality, the mayor of Nancy understood something that Blaskowitz's orders could not change. Nancy contained no significant military installations or strategic factories. The German forces occupying the city would almost certainly destroy the historic bridges and the irreplaceable Baroque architecture before retreating if they felt directly threatened by an American assault. If the Americans attacked Nancy directly, the city would be caught between two fires: German defenders and American artillery. Civilian casualties would be severe. The cultural heritage of one of France's most beautiful cities would be destroyed. The mayor was not asking Patton to abandon his campaign or halt his advance toward Germany. He was asking the most aggressive armored commander in the Allied army to please go around Nancy instead of through it. General Manton Eddy brought the letter to Patton's attention along with a carefully phrased suggestion. Perhaps, Eddy proposed, they should honor the mayor's request. Perhaps a direct frontal assault on Nancy was not worth the cost in lives and time if an alternative route could achieve the same strategic objectives. Patton's response is usually reduced in popular accounts to an image of him pounding the table and declaring that nothing would stop Third Army from advancing. The actual exchange reveals something more interesting about how Patton's mind worked. He studied the map carefully. He pointed to the Moselle River crossings that ran through Nancy. He pointed to the road network on the eastern bank that led toward Germany. Those bridges were not a convenience for Third Army's logistics. They were a structural requirement for continuing the offensive. Without armored forces crossing the Moselle at Nancy or very nearby, Third Army's advance toward the Rhine would slow to an unacceptable crawl. The mayor's request, however understandable from a civilian perspective, was asking Patton to accept a geographic constraint the campaign could not afford. But here is what most historical accounts of this episode completely miss. Patton did not respond to the mayor's letter by immediately ordering a direct assault on Nancy. He responded by studying the terrain map more carefully than he had before. Patton had been in enough campaigns to understand something important about obstacles. When a direct approach is blocked or becomes unacceptably costly, the operational question is not whether to proceed toward your objective. The question is whether the defensive system you are facing has a structural weakness that can be exploited. The mayor's letter had, without anyone intending this outcome, drawn Patton's attention to every crossing point and approach route that was not Nancy itself. One of those alternative locations was about to change the entire operational picture. The first attempt to force a Moselle crossing came on September 5th. General Eddy ordered the 81st Infantry Division to push across the river north of Nancy at a town called Pont-à-Mousson. The tactical reasoning was sound. German defenses had been under sustained pressure for weeks. Intelligence suggested enemy forces in this sector were thinly spread and potentially demoralized. The crossing did not go according to plan. German defenders on the eastern bank had used the 5-day fuel pause to prepare for exactly this kind of river assault. As American infantry units reached the western bank and attempted to cross in assault boats, German forces on the elevated ground beyond the river responded with concentrated machine gun and mortar fire from carefully prepared positions. American casualties were significant. No foothold was established on the far bank. Units pulled back under fire. General Eddy's instinct, entirely reasonable from a conventional military perspective, was to pause. His staff recommended bringing up more artillery, waiting perhaps a week for better weather conditions and more preparation, then attempting the crossing again with overwhelming fire support and better planning. Patton drove to 12th Corps headquarters and rejected that approach. This was not a decision driven by impatience for its own sake. Patton understood something specific about how the time constraint was functioning. Every single day, Third Army waited on the western bank of the Moselle. The German defensive structure on the eastern bank was getting measurably stronger. New units were arriving from Germany. Defensive positions were being improved. Minefields were being expanded. Artillery was being registered on likely crossing points. The window of opportunity during which a successful crossing was achievable was closing incrementally with every passing hour. Waiting a week did not mean attempting the same difficult operation with better preparation. It meant attempting a significantly harder operation against a significantly stronger defense. The cost of operational delay was not zero. It was accumulating, and Patton understood that delay could transform a difficult problem into an impossible one. South of Nancy, the Moselle River bent in a way that changed the terrain significantly. The elevation of the far bank decreased. The current was somewhat more manageable, and critically, German defensive concentration was considerably thinner in this sector, partly because the terrain was less obviously valuable from a defensive perspective, and partly because German forces had finite resources and could not strongly defend every possible crossing point simultaneously. Near a small town called Dieu-Louard, American reconnaissance units found what they were looking for: a section of riverbank where the current was manageable for assault boats, where the far bank's elevation was lower and provided less advantage to defenders, where German presence was substantially lighter than at the crossing points the enemy had prioritized. On the night of September 11th, 1944, under a rainstorm that reduced visibility to nearly zero, elements of the 81st Infantry Division moved quietly to the river's edge at Dieu-Louard. There was no preliminary artillery bombardment, no airstrikes, no attempt to soften up the far bank. Just infantry soldiers, assault boats, and rain that provided natural concealment. They crossed the Moselle River. The initial foothold was small and precarious, but it was real. And once that foothold existed on the eastern bank, the entire American logistical and engineering system could begin to function. Combat engineers moved to the crossing site immediately and began constructing a treadway bridge capable of supporting armored vehicles. By the morning of September 12th, the first Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division were crossing the Moselle River south of Nancy. This is the structural turning point of the entire Nancy operation. Patton had not captured the city. He had not resolved the mayor's refusal. He had not even addressed the German defenses inside Nancy. What he had done was moved the decisive point of the operation to a location where the mayor's concerns and the German defensive preparations simply did not apply. American armor was now on the eastern bank of the Moselle, and that changed everything. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the lead armored task force of the 4th Armored Division that crossed at Dieulouard. The orders Patton gave to Abrams were precise and revealing. Abrams was not ordered to attack Nancy. He was ordered to bypass it entirely. This distinction carries most of the operational weight in understanding what happened next. A direct assault on a fortified city with a river protecting its western approaches and elevated terrain dominating its eastern flank is an extraordinarily consuming military operation. It costs time, it costs lives, and critically, it costs operational momentum that a mobile campaign needs to maintain elsewhere. But a city only functions as a viable defensive position for as long as its supply lines and escape routes remain open and intact. Once those routes are cut, the garrison inside faces a stark choice: attempt a costly breakout through encircling forces, or sit in place and wait. Abrams' armored column drove rapidly around Nancy's eastern and southern flanks at a pace that consistently outran German logistics and command communications in the rear areas. German staff reports from this period describe a repeated pattern of confusion and disorganization, specifically because American armor was appearing at critical road junctions and supply depots before German headquarters had even updated their situation maps to reflect American positions. The Germans recognized the danger and responded. A counterattack was organized using relatively fresh armored units that had not been through the severe attrition of the August retreat, including Panther tanks. The counterattack developed near the town of Ericourt, approximately 20 kilometers southeast of Nancy, beginning around September 18th. What followed became the largest sustained armored engagement involving American forces on the Western Front in 1944. On paper, the tactical situation appeared to favor the Germans. American units were equipped primarily with M4 Sherman tanks. Against a Panther at medium to long range, the Sherman was at a clear disadvantage in both gun penetration and frontal armor protection. The German qualitative advantage in tank versus tank combat was real and well documented. But the engagement at Ericourt did not unfold at long range. Autumn weather settled over the Lorraine Plateau. Thick fog reduced visibility to a few hundred meters at best. The Panthers' significant advantage in long-range gunnery simply disappeared in conditions where no one could see beyond a few hundred yards. American tank crews, operating with superior radio coordination and greater tactical flexibility in small unit operations, adapted more effectively to the limited visibility. They worked in small teams using terrain features for concealment. They maneuvered to engage German armor from angles where the Panthers' frontal armor advantage mattered considerably less. Over 4 days of intermittent but intense fighting, the counterattack gradually lost operational cohesion. By September 22nd, the German attack had effectively stopped functioning as a coordinated operation. German armored units pulled back, having failed to break the American bridgehead or relieve Nancy. The encirclement of the city was complete. Inside Nancy, the German garrison commander understood the tactical reality. The counterattack at Aricourt had failed. Hitler's orders were explicit: hold Nancy at all costs. But holding a city with American armored forces blocking every exit road was not a militarily viable operation. It was simply waiting to be captured. On the night of September 15, 1944, German forces inside Nancy began a systematic withdrawal under cover of darkness. Before evacuating, German engineers attempted to demolish the main bridges across the Moselle River. Standard procedure. But French resistance networks operating inside Nancy had been monitoring German activities closely. Resistance members had already located and severed the detonation wires leading to the explosive charges. When German engineers triggered the demolitions, nothing happened. The bridges remained intact. American forces from the 81st Infantry Division entered Nancy on September 15, 1944. They advanced through streets that showed minimal damage. They walked into the Place Stanislas, one of the finest Baroque squares in all of Europe, completely undamaged. The famous golden gates were intact. The cathedral was untouched. The residential neighborhood showed no signs of combat. The mayor's letter had requested exactly this outcome. He simply had not obtained it through the mechanism he had envisioned. He had received it because Patton chose an operational method that made the city's interior completely irrelevant to the military campaign. The fighting had occurred at river crossings, on the Aricourt Plateau, and in the hills south of Nancy. Nancy itself had been the strategic objective, but it had not become a battleground. When Patton visited Nancy in the days immediately following its liberation, he walked through the Place Stanislas and specifically noted that the architecture had survived intact. Contemporary accounts of his meeting with French city officials described the exchange as considerably more cordial than might have been expected given the initial refusal. Both the Americans and the French had arrived at the same desired result through entirely different chains of reasoning. The city was liberated. The German garrison had been neutralized without urban combat. The historic core of Nancy remained exactly as it had been before the campaign began. The story of Nancy tends to be told in popular histories as a story about George Patton's personality, his aggression, his refusal to accept obstacles, his willingness to drive forward when more cautious commanders would have hesitated. That framing captures something true about Patton's command style. It misses a more important lesson about operational thinking. What Patton actually did at Nancy was not simply push harder against the obstacle in front of him. He read the obstacle as a question. The mayor's refusal, the failed crossing at Pont-à-Mousson, the German defensive concentration around Nancy. Each of these was directing attention toward something, toward a stretch of riverbank south of the city, where the current was more manageable and the defenders were thinner, toward a crossing at Dieu-Loir that nobody had prioritized because it was not obvious. The German counterattack at Aricourt collapsed when fog neutralized the equipment advantages the attackers were counting on. Each apparent setback or constraint redirected the operational system toward solutions that had not been prioritized in the original planning. If you visit Nancy today, the Place Stanislas looks essentially as it did in September 1944. The Golden Gates are there. The fountain operates. The Baroque facades are preserved. Most visitors walk through the square without any knowledge of the military decisions that kept it intact. Near Court, the plateau where the tank battles occurred, is now quiet agricultural land. For decades after the war, farmers plowing their fields would occasionally turn up metal fragments from the September 1944 engagements. The city that asked to be left alone was, in the end, left almost exactly as it had been. That outcome was not inevitable. It required a particular kind of operational thinking, not simply the determination to overcome obstacles, but the intellectual discipline to read an obstacle as a question. To ask not just how to break through it, but what the obstacle itself was revealing about where the actual opening might be found. Patton understood that distinction, and Nancy survived because of it.